Welcome to Shove Memorial Chapel and our lecture this evening with Sarah McCammon, author of The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, sponsored by the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, in which I am a postdoc. Thank you for joining us. Before we begin, I want to invite you to silence your phones, be respectful of your other attendees, and to note where all of the restrooms in the building are. To your left, here through this door, there are down the stairs 2 bathrooms here, as well as a water fountain. There is an accessible and gender-neutral bathroom through these doors to your right. And then at the back, in the narthex where you entered, there are 2 bathrooms as well, one on either side. Following Ms. McCammon's lecture, there will be an open Q&A session, and we invite you to use this microphone here down in front, which will be live and active for your use. Please form an orderly line and join us in the conversation. After the Q&A is concluded, there will also be a book signing here in the side chapel to the right of the chancel, as sponsored by the Colorado College Bookstore. I wish to recognize our director, Jeffrey Scholes, and our associate directors, Paul Harvey and George Bayuga, whose work to found this center in this city at this moment in our nation's history represents a profoundly important investment in our ability to understand this moment we are living through when others long after us reflect back on it for generations to come. Now, more than ever, we need the resources, tools, and infrastructures of understanding that scholarship provides and our community furnishes. I wish to recognize the incredible generosity of our community, including an amazing anonymous matching donation of $25,000 that we invite you to help realize by sharing whatever gift, no matter how small, knowing it will be doubled to help us ensure that this center and its work will continue to live for generations to come. There are tables in the narthex with information that can help walk you through the process of giving, and of course myself and center staff are happy to speak with you after the lecture as well. I also invite you to connect with the center and hear about our other upcoming events by signing up for our newsletter. Also at the tables in the narthex, we have some student volunteers there who are happy to help you through that process. Now, it is my distinct pleasure to introduce the director of the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, Dr. Jeffrey Scholes. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. Before I introduce our speaker, I want to say a couple things in addition to what Ben said about the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism that myself and 2 colleagues started last year. We received a generous grant from the Luce Foundation early in 2024, and with that money, we'd already kind of decided that we wanted to start a Center for the Study of Evangelicalism along with 2 other projects. And a part of it, the genesis of it at least, started kind of with some conversations with Paul and I. Paul is in the history department, as Ben said, around polling numbers coming out of the 2016 presidential election and the 2020 presidential election, which showed about 81% of white evangelicals voting for Donald Trump. So we knew that, evangelicalism has certainly been in the news, as 1976 was the year of the evangelical. At the same time, too, there was seemingly a new way or a new, perhaps, urgency for evangelicals, for non-evangelicals, for ex-evangelicals, with a kind of political mark to it, that we thought perhaps a center that would investigate evangelicalism and things that are adjacent to evangelicalism would help foster. So that was right, kind of the part of the genesis of it. In addition, we looked around the country and we didn't see any center existent that studies evangelicalism, or at least says it does specifically. So that was another kind of motivation for us to start one. And thirdly, we're in Colorado Springs. So we knew that even people outside of Colorado Springs at times identify, for better for worse, evangelicalism with Colorado Springs, so we wouldn't have to necessarily explain why we're starting a center like this at UCCS. The mission of the center is really twofold. One is, and kind of the primary focus of it, is scholarly. We're scholars. We're at a university. We wish to really examine, analyze evangelicalism and things related to it, which includes Exvangelicals, or those who have left the church, as we'll hear from our speaker a little later. But all that to say is that we've kind of gotten curiosity from people in the community since we kind of got the center started last year about what our real agenda is. Again, as scholars, we're seeking to understand something. And in the case for the center, the object of our study is evangelicalism. So we don't have any overriding or underwriting ideology that drives us. We're not here to necessarily certainly promote nor critique as a part of our mission. We're just here to examine it, and we think there's no better time than now to examine it, and no better place than UCCS to house a center that will host these kinds of examinations. And the second part of it is the community. We, at a public university, a part of the mission at UCCS and other state universities, is to engage the community and to have engagement from the community inform us. And with evangelicalism or Exvangelicalism here in Colorado Springs, it's a really central part of the mission of our center. So we want to hear from you. And we hope that you will continue to come to events and engage with us. To that end, we had an event last week. We asked about 4 community members to come and speak on their experience of leaving the evangelical church. We had it at Kinship Landing, and it was really well attended. I can barely see out in the crowd, but I trust that there's some of you that are here that either attended or perhaps on the panel. But it was a wonderful event, and it forebode of a really wonderful event that we'll have with Sarah McCammon in a bit. A couple of thank yous to the Henry Luce Foundation for the grant that they provided. Are my associate directors, Paul Harvey and George Bayuga at UCCS. I want to thank Kate Holbrook here in the chaplain's office at Colorado College. She was very instrumental in making this happen in this, of course, gorgeous space in Shove Memorial Chapel. We're honored to be here. We've done a couple events in other churches, but of course this one kind of takes the cake. So thank you to Kate. And to Clay Bowen, who is videoing the event, and he's filmed several of other events that we've had. Does a wonderful job. This lecture is being filmed. It'll be on our website, so if you just kind of Google the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism, it'll pop up immediately, and you can see past events that we've done, and this one as well. And finally, I want to thank Ben Slidham, who spoke to you a second ago. He's our postdoctoral fellow in the center. He's been absolutely instrumental in making things happen for us. He's an essential piece of the center, so thank you, Ben. Okay. Sarah McCammon is a national political correspondent for NPR and co-host of the NPR Politics podcast. Her work focuses on political, social, and cultural divides in America, including abortion policy and the intersections of politics and religion. She has appeared on numerous television programs, including CNN's Inside Politics, MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes, PBS NewsHour, and C-SPAN's Washington Journal. McCammon is the author of The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church, a 2024 book that is part memoir, part journalism, about the movement of people who grew up inside the powerful evangelical subculture and ultimately left in response to its increased politicization. So please join me in welcoming Sarah McCammon to the stage.
Well, hello. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you, Dr. Scholes, for that lovely introduction. I want to also thank Ben Slidham and everyone at the Center for the Study of Evangelicalism at UCCS for putting this event together. The study of evangelicalism is, I think we can all agree, after the events of the last 10 years, essential for understanding American culture and American politics. But for some of us here, it's not just academic. I know it will probably surprise you to look at me, but I did grow up evangelical in the Midwest. I recognize that I probably code as more Fox News than NPR, but I learned how to get my hair this big from the wonderful stylist at the PBS NewsHour, so there's still hope. But in all seriousness, I was so delighted to learn that UCCS was creating this center. As we all now understand, evangelicalism is much more than a religious movement or a set of doctrinal commitments. It is a powerful social, cultural, and political force, and an idea that is debated and often contested, and those are the kinds of ideas that merit study. I'm here tonight to talk about evangelical politics, which I've covered for a decade now, and Exvangelicals, people like me who were shaped by the movement but have shifted away from an evangelical identity for a variety of reasons, some of which have to do with politics and some of which don't. But the rise of Donald Trump, many Americans outside of the evangelical movement and some within it have struggled to understand his appeal to evangelical Christians. I came to realize through my reporting that understanding the evangelical world, the way evangelicals think and view the world, actually helps to explain that appeal. I also came to realize, maybe paradoxically, that for some evangelicals, the growing alliance with the right-wing political project embodied by Trump had forced a reckoning with what it means to be evangelical. For our purposes and for the purpose of my book, I use the term broadly, the way it's often employed by other journalists as well as pollsters. I'm talking about theologically conservative Protestant Christians who generally take the Bible literally, believe that Jesus is the only way to heaven, and believe it's their purpose on earth to share Jesus with non-believers. That's called evangelizing, of course. Increasingly, in my lifetime, it's also come to represent a vision for the family and the society that often translates into a political project, which has become increasingly aligned with the right wing of the Republican Party. But I want to start with the personal and work back to the professional. My own story begins in early 1981, about 2 weeks after Ronald Reagan was elected, in a conservative Christian home in the heartland, which I would later realize existed squarely within the evangelical movement that has become such a powerful force in American life. But to me, it was just my community and my world. I didn't understand it as such at the time, but evangelicalism was my culture. I was raised on cartoons like Superbook from the Christian Broadcasting Network, attended a K-12 Christian school that taught young earth creationism from textbooks published by Bob Jones University and similar institutions. I spent summers on youth group missions, passing out Christian tracts on the street corners in inner city Kansas City. And yes, James Dobson, who founded an organization some of you may have heard of, was one of the most influential icons of my childhood, someone my family turned to for everything from parenting advice to political guidance. Several summers, we made the long, very flat drive from Kansas City all the way through the state of Kansas to Colorado for family vacations. And during at least one of those trips, we made a stop at the Evangelical Vatican, focus on the family headquarters, right here in Colorado Springs. I remember going down some big slide and visiting the bookstore and I think one of the radio programs. I describe this upbringing in detail in my book, The Exvangelicals, Loving, Living, and Leaving the White Evangelical Church. And as I explain, this evangelical bubble I was cocooned within was designed to make sure that I and other evangelical children like me would absorb the moral, theological, and political framework that was being taught by my church and school and countless leaders of the movement, including Dobson and many, many more. This swaddling in a carefully curated evangelical subculture was seen as necessary in order to protect us from a larger world that was seen as increasingly fraught with moral decay, as evidenced by social movements that had gained traction, such as feminism and the movement for gay rights. And this, by the way, is important for understanding something I'm going to talk about quite a bit this evening, the rise of Donald Trump. For many evangelicals, Trump's promise to make America great again seems to point back to an earlier era when, in their view, America was better, more Christian, more traditional, more patriarchal, more religious, when predominantly white Protestant culture was dominant in American society, including politics. And for many of the ex-evangelicals I know, this separation from the larger world ultimately became untenable and was central to why they ultimately left an evangelical identity. But while we were in it, the evangelical world of my childhood offered us many things, most of all, a sense of purpose and a sense of who we were. We were encouraged to think of ourselves as set apart unto God, as standing up for truth in a world that was morally fallen and getting worse. There was clarity and certainty in that worldview, and a comforting sense of being on the righteous path. For many of us who would become what you might call ex-evangelicals, that relationship with certainty eventually began to waver. We started asking questions, some theological, some scientific, others political, and others deeply personal, that did not seem to fit the answers we were being offered by our spiritual leaders. As for me, by my early 20s, I was no longer attending evangelical churches. I didn't shift away out of a desire to rebel or cause pain to my family or evangelical friends. I left slowly and gradually after trying a lot of different churches, rather quietly and with some shame, because I no longer felt that the ideas I was being asked to embody, endorse, and promote made sense when weighed against the complexity of what I was seeing in the world and in myself. At the time, I didn't have a name for this experience. I just knew I felt adrift and sometimes frightened, but also liberated and freed to follow my questions wherever they might lead. I think that's part of why I became a journalist, because I realized quickly that I was more interested in the questions than anything. More than a decade after I made my sort of quiet break with evangelicalism, while working as a journalist at NPR, I would find myself covering the same evangelical world I'd stepped away from. And that assignment, as it turned out, coincided with the rise of one of the most divisive political figures in modern American history. In the summer of 2015, I was recruited by NPR to cover the presidential campaign, and I was assigned to the Republican primary. One of my early stops was at a Trump rally at a retirement community near Bluffton, South Carolina. As I arrived at the auditorium that sunny afternoon, there was energy in the air. Trump supporters and some curious onlookers filled the room. Outside, a small band of protesters held handmade signs opposing Trump's rhetoric about immigrants. Trump walked on stage and told the audience, "There's a silent majority out there. We're tired of being pushed around, kicked around, and acting and being led by stupid people." Beyond Trump's words and demeanor, what really made an impression on me was the audience, their enthusiasm, their belief that Trump was onto something and was speaking for them in a unique way. One couple, James and Juliet Kerr, told me they wanted their children and grandchildren to, quote, remember how great this country was. When I asked how they remembered it, Juliet said, free to walk the streets. There was no political correctness. You could come and go as you pleased and not worry. And James said, politicians actually did represent the people. To be clear, I didn't ask these folks, the people I met that day, about their religious beliefs. In fact, I didn't think Trump would be around for long. Most pundits were predicting his demise. But the themes I heard from these mostly white, middle-class retirees in South Carolina would be echoed in the coming months by many more Trump supporters I would meet on the campaign trail, including many white evangelicals and other religious conservatives. The voters I met on the campaign trail in the following months didn't just like Trump's policies. They liked what they saw as a rejection of political correctness that was hamstringing the country, and a willingness to stand up to the elites in government and the media, who they felt despised them and actively opposed their values. That was particularly important for the evangelical Christians I encountered. When I attended that rally in South Carolina in the summer of 2015, as I said, I believed what most pundits were saying, that Trump would be a flash in the pan, and that Republican voters would eventually want someone more mainstream. But Trump continued to command a sizable share of the Republican primary polls, which led many observers to ask the question, will the party's evangelical base support him? A question that became more urgent as Trump continued to rise through the course of the primary season. On paper, of course, Trump, with his brash language and complicated personal history, seemed like an odd fit for a community that had long emphasized the importance of family values. One of the things I write about in the book that I remembered and was thinking about at this time was how my community, when I was 17 in 1998, during the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal, had responded to that event. In May of 2016, I visited a conservative church in Iowa to report on some of the misgivings that some evangelicals were expressing. At Fort Des Moines Church of Christ, Pastor Mike Damastis, who was vocally opposed to abortion, called Trump reprehensible and told me that his ascent in the primary meant that, quote, the true evangelical is in a quandary, a dilemma. That dilemma was felt intensely by some evangelical women I interviewed several months later, after the infamous Access Hollywood video surfaced, in which Trump could be heard bragging about groping women without consent. I spoke with several women who were wrestling with their movement's continued embrace of Trump. Some said that women who'd experienced sexual harassment or abuse were finding the moment particularly distressing. Christian singer-songwriter Nicole Nordeman said in an interview with us that too many evangelical male leaders were failing to step up to the moment. She said, quote, "I find it sickening that these men can face their congregations and their families and their college campuses and feel okay with trusting Donald Trump with their voice and their vote in their country, and still somehow explain it away through the lens of the teachings of Christ. It boggles my mind." And then she said something that ultimately, years later, would lead me to write this book. She said, "In the circles that I run in, I keep hearing the term exvangelical thrown around quite a bit. Just the sense that we are trying to find new language to define us as followers of Christ, because this old term has felt unbelievably compromised by this election and by some of the old guard in evangelical leadership." So I started paying attention to some of the conversations that were unfolding around these concerns in the years that followed. A lot of them were being led by women, and many were happening online in the democratized space of the internet, where women like Jen Hatmaker or Beth Moore and many others could command a massive following, even if many churches wouldn't allow them in the pulpit. The podcaster Blake Chastain had created the hashtag Exvangelical, and a host of fascinating conversations were unfolding on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and eventually TikTok. I watched in fascination because I resonated with many of these conversations, given my own background. Conversations about the meaning of evangelicalism. They were talking about Trump, but they were also talking about a host of other issues, from feminism to sexuality and purity culture to science and religious trauma. So some evangelicals were leaving their churches or rethinking their evangelical identity, but many others were sticking by Trump. According to one survey by the Pew Research Center in 2021, there's some indication that some Americans who like Trump were actually newly adopting the evangelical label, whether or not they actually shared a commitment to or deep knowledge of evangelical theology. But let's fast forward to early last year. I'd spent the intervening years since the end of the 2016 campaign, mostly covering the abortion issue, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which was, of course, a major achievement of the Christian right, in which Trump played an instrumental role by selecting Supreme Court justices who would ultimately issue that decision after he left office. By 2024, Trump was facing ongoing legal issues, of course, including multiple criminal indictments in the aftermath of the January 6th attack on the US Capitol. For most politicians, this would have meant the end of a political career, and I wondered if it would in any way shake his evangelical support. So in January of last year, I traveled back to Iowa to cover the caucuses. Again, Trump faced, like in 2016, a large group of Republican rivals. Evangelicals who felt a commitment to the Republican Party and felt it aligned with their beliefs, again had many other choices among the Republican pool. And again, they rallied around Trump. I met a woman named Shelley Burrow at an event near Des Moines. She told me she was an evangelical and she'd supported Trump since 2016. I asked her for her feelings about Trump's moral character. "Have you read the Bible?" she asked me. I told her that I had. "Many of the people in the Bible were married multiple times and they didn't always do the perfect thing," she told me. "People aren't perfect. God is perfect," she said. She did not think the charges Trump was facing in connection with efforts to overturn the 2020 election were legitimate, and she didn't think they would stick. I also interviewed Iowa State Representative Brad Sherman, also an evangelical pastor in addition to a state lawmaker, and he told me something that I've heard from evangelicals over the years. He said he himself wouldn't talk like Trump, he's a pastor after all, but he didn't really mind. He saw Trump's style as an asset in a world where evangelicals felt their belief system and their values were under attack. "Yeah, he's brash and he's a fighter," he said. "That's who we need right now in the political arena and the political atmosphere that exists. You gotta be tough." That same year, Trump posted a video on Truth Social in which he held up the God Bless the USA branded Bible, which featured not only scriptures, but also several key American documents, including the US Constitution. He warned that Christians are under siege and promised to bring Christianity back, and offered the Bible for $59.99 plus shipping. In November, the white evangelical vote held fast, with about 80% of those voters again supporting Trump, as they had in the previous two elections. But what's intriguing, and I think an important avenue for further reporting and study now, is the fact that Trump appears to be expanding his appeal beyond white Christians. White, college-educated voters, especially women, were one of very few demographics where Democrats gained ground in this past election. Republicans, meanwhile, picked up support in almost every other demographic, particularly non-white demographics. Among them, as you likely know by now, Latino voters and young Black men, as well as younger voters in general, all groups that had been seen as critical parts of the Democratic coalition. Not to say that those groups, a majority still supported Harris, the Democratic candidate, but the Republicans and Trump gained ground with those groups in ways I think many observers did not expect. That's something I've been exploring in the months since November. The weekend after the election, I traveled to a Latino evangelical church in Pennsylvania and spoke with Hispanic faith leaders and congregants who told me that Trump was the only candidate who'd been addressing many of their concerns. On the economy, yes, but also on social policy. Some mentioned their opposition to abortion or their concern about transgender policies that they see as at odds with their beliefs. One woman, Erica Vega, who is a naturalized citizen born in Colombia, told me of Trump, "I don't know if he's a Christian or not, but I at least see that he respects the believers." I asked several people at the church, including Vega, about Trump's promise to deport undocumented immigrants. She said it's not easy and she feels for people who want to become Americans, but she said she also felt Trump was trying to protect the country, and she supported that. And it's not just evangelicals. I heard similar sentiments from Asian American voters on a reporting trip to Nevada just last week. These voters were not, by and large, evangelicals, but like Vega, they were non-white voters who supported Trump and see themselves as conservative. They told me their parents and other ancestors had followed the rules and immigrated legally, and they were persuaded by Trump's claims that undocumented immigration was destabilizing to the well-being of Americans. Some also expressed frustration with diversity, equity, and inclusion policies in education and corporate America that they felt were privileging other minority groups to the detriment of Asian American applicants. I made another reporting trip recently to the Dearborn area in Michigan to talk with Muslim and Arab voters who had supported Trump. Again, I heard about economic concerns, but also social and cultural issues. One of the places I visited was Hamtramck, Michigan, a town outside Detroit with an all-Muslim city council where in 2023, the council voted unanimously to ban the display of most flags, including pride flags, during June, which is Pride Month. This garnered some pushback from Michigan Democrats. Then, last year, the mayor of Hamtramck, Amr Ghalib, endorsed Trump. Trump made significant gains in Hamtramck compared to 4 years before. And when I visited earlier this year, the mayor explained it this way. Our community is conservative. They care about raising their kids the way they want, not letting others implement some values that conflict with our values. We hear good stuff from his side about this, protecting the next generation and the family values. Ghalib, by the way, has recently been named by Trump as an ambassador to Kuwait. In that story, I heard echoes of some of the culture war battles that have become a familiar feature of evangelical politics for decades now. This, of course, is not just about flags or local school board elections. It's about a broader perception among some Americans with deeply held religious beliefs that their beliefs are being sidelined in the name of tolerance. And at least in the 2024 election, it appears that Trump's willingness to unapologetically wade into these debates resonated with some new groups. So it will be interesting to see how the definition of religious conservative expands. Will it include Muslim Americans? And what about race? Will Republicans continue to successfully reach out to communities of color, or is this a one-time blip? How will the white Christian majority of the Republican Party interact with these groups? White evangelical Christians remain a cornerstone of Donald Trump's support, and he would not have won without them. But his base is evolving. It now includes a broader array of religious conservatives, many of whom are navigating their own questions of belonging and cultural identity. As for the ex-evangelicals, those of us who left, our stories are also part of this larger reckoning and rethinking. Ex-evangelicals are barely studied and, like evangelicals, difficult to define. According to one estimate from a friend at the Public Religion Research Institute, they likely number in the millions, maybe 10 million, based on data about religious disaffiliation. And that trend, disaffiliation, has been the biggest trend in American religion. We can talk about religion all we want, but we have to talk about the fact that there is less and less of it proportionately in this country. And the decline is happening certainly across white Christianity, not only evangelicalism. Before I turn to your questions in a few minutes, I want to acknowledge that amidst all the changes in the American religious landscape, the largest appears to be the growing number of Americans who affiliate with nothing at all, what some pollsters and demographers call the nones, N-O-N-E-S. Some are ex-evangelicals, but some are ex-Catholics or ex-Mormons, and so on. The trend toward religious decline may be leveling off, according to some of the newest data I've seen in recent weeks, but it could reshape American politics in a country where religion is so central to identity and has become so central to the way we think about politics, particularly on the right. Religious nuns, according to the data I've seen, tend to lean liberal, but they appear to be much less politically engaged and harder to mobilize than religious conservatives. All told, I believe that as the country becomes more diverse, our changing demographics are reshaping the evangelical church and complicating our understanding of the interactions between race, religion, and politics in fascinating ways that we are just beginning to recognize, and which we should all try to understand. That's why the work of institutions like this center is so exciting and so timely, and I look forward to what you all discover. So thank you again. And with that, we'll take questions.
Thank you very much to Sarah McCammon once again for her remarks. I appreciate you coming out. And I invite all of you to please come to this mic here up front and ask some questions. We are excited to hear from you.
Hello.
Hi.
Thank you. That was really nice. My question, I guess, is kind of two-pronged. You talked a little bit about the politicization of evangelical Christianity, and I would suppose like one part of that is being raised in it. You become more aware as you grow up that it is kind of a political thing, and you get faced with, you said, political, spiritual, other questions about, and you're like, well, I don't think this evangelicalism really answers all of that. So I'm asking, like, what's an example of one of those questions that kind of bothered you, and how would an evangelical respond to that question?
Yeah. Well, I sort of organized the book thematically around some of those questions. And there were so many, and they came up at different times. I mean, I opened the book talking about my family praying for my grandfather, who was really one of very few sort of secular people that we knew. And I don't think it's giving away too much if you haven't read the book yet, but I hope you still will. He came out late in life as gay, and so, this was the mid-1980s at a time when my parents were deeply enmeshed in the Christian right. It was the center of their life, and the politics went with that. We went to anti-abortion marches. As time went by, my parents fought against same-sex marriage, and, so my grandpa was this person who lived, about 10 minutes from us, and was a family member and represented everything we were told was bad. And so that created a lot of questions for me. I mean, first of all, just about the place in the world of non-Christians, non-believers. I was told that he and others were going to hell, and this is why we prayed every night at dinner that he would get saved. And I always struggled with that. I mean, I believed it because it was what I was told, but the older I got, the more it was hard to make sense of, why this lovely man, a neurosurgeon who was truly one of the most accomplished people I knew, was such a problem. And I guess the way that would be answered, I share some exchanges with my parents about LGBTQ issues, and I think the answer is there's this very literal belief in the Bible. There's this belief that the Bible teaches, that homosexuality is a sin, that the only way to God is through, a prayer of salvation in Jesus, and that's what it says, and that's the end of it. I mean, it's pretty much, I think, where it stops. And for me, and I think for a lot of the other people I interviewed in the book, reckoning with that tension, that cognitive dissonance, the ideas that we were taught, and really the people that we love that didn't match those ideas was sort of the beginning of the end.
That was beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you.
What would you say is the most important role for current evangelicals who disagree kind of with the trajectory of Christianity right now? What would you say, is their most important role in combating the rise in far-right evangelicalism and extremist Christian ideology?
Well, one of the themes I've covered over the years is efforts by sort of the Christian left, the religious left, you might call it, which includes some progressive evangelicals and also mainline Protestants and Catholics and others, to sort of speak to the fact that there isn't just one story about what Christians in America think. And the reality is that, going all the way back to the civil rights movement and the anti-slavery movement, there's a long history of social justice activism by Christians. And so, I think the right, for various reasons, which partly include, I think, funding, has been more successful at mobilizing the religious vote for, the Christian right vote as opposed to the Christian left. I think the left sort of, tends to be a little more diffuse, a little less unified on certain issues, and there are a variety of challenges. But there's been an ongoing effort for many years. I mean, I could name groups like Sojourners with Jim Wallace. I talk in my book about Vote Common Good, which is a group that formed in, I think, 2018 in response to Trump specifically, in an effort to move specifically evangelical voters and sort of evangelical adjacent Christians who had misgivings about the state of the Republican Party and the alignment with their religious movement. So those voices are out there. I think they will continue to be out there.
Thank you.
I'm having trouble getting this into a question, so I'll make it a statement and let you respond to it. Having grown up in a quote-unquote evangelical church family, and Dad was a preacher, went to Christian university and all this. It seems to me about the time you were being born, I was studying Masters of Divinity, and I was noticing this coalition of evangelicals and Americanism. And it strikes me, as I've listened to you and a few others recently, that the unifying theme that brings this weird coalition together on the right is exceptionalism. All the churches, the evangelical churches, are always exceptional. We're the only ones going to heaven generally, whereas mainline Christian churches are more open and receiving. So respond to this fact that, hey, I'm a part of something that's exceptional. And then you put God's blessing on top of that, and you've got a mighty fortress.
I mean, I think I spoke to that a little bit at the beginning of my talk with this idea that we believed we had the truth, and we believed that we were sort of embodying that truth and had God's favor. There's, a belief that, which really stems from, Protestantism writ large, that you can read the Bible and know what it means for yourself, and we thought we had it right. And, and I think, like I said, there is an appeal in that. There's a comfort in that. There's the world is a big, scary, complicated place, and everybody needs to sort of know who they are, who their community is, what they're doing here, what their purpose is. I think we talk a lot and think a lot the last several years since the pandemic and even before about how many people struggle with loneliness and a sense of isolation, especially young people. And, religion has historically been sort of an antidote to that. It's provided community and also, again, an identity, this is who we are. And so I think when the answer to who we are is sort of God's favored people and the people who have it right and the people that God wants to share the truth with the rest of the world. I mean, that's a really good feeling if you believe it. And so I think that's where a lot of it comes from.
Hi, Sarah. Thank you for your talk and for your book. I'm just curious, how would you describe your relationship with your family now, and in particular, for those of us that are, identify as evangelicals, how we maintain those relationships that are often fraught?
Yeah, I get asked about this at almost every talk because it's a real concern for a lot of people. And, I describe in the book the ways that a few different friends or acquaintances of mine have navigated it. And I think the answers are as individual as the people and their circumstances. Some people, especially some of my LGBTQ friends, have navigated in really complicated ways that not everybody would find acceptable, sort of staying away from certain topics, maybe not introducing partners to family. I mean, those things are really painful, and not everyone is willing to accept that or able to accept that. And so I certainly don't have any advice about how one should. But I think, in my own experience, it's been very up and down. And, I'm happy to say that I think the last few years have been better. Maybe because, in part, through writing this book, there's been a lot of honesty and direct conversation about things that maybe we talked around before. But, I always hesitate to give advice because the situations are so individual, the personalities are so individual. I mean, there are people who really don't talk to their families, and that's painful and sad, but it may be the right choice for some people. There are others who, like I said, reach these kind of détentes that are maybe unsatisfying, but workable. And then, there are others that I think manage to maintain a closeness across difference. And then I've also, one of the most kind of encouraging things about writing this book and going around talking to groups like this is I've met several parents of adult children who've, come to me in signing lines or reached out in social media privately and said, essentially, I read your book and I'm evangelical, I raised my kids in evangelicalism, but I kind of feel like I understand now why they had such a hard time with it. And, in some cases, those parents are not able to have a relationship with their children, but in other cases they are. And, that gives me a lot of hope. I think that everybody, I think there's a lot of value in listening and communicating, and it's part of why I do what I do. I still maybe naively hold out hope that trying to understand each other will create some progress. But again, I would never want to dictate to anybody what they should do in their individual situation.
Hey, thanks again. It seems like one of the stressing factors of these issues is maybe just the nature of our political system and being bipartisan, and in terms of a left and a right and a good and a bad, how it's perceived. Do you speak to any evangelicals as you're out and about in terms of who just feel stuck, in terms of the fact that they can't see themselves voting Democrat, really don't like what's going on the Republican side, but still identify evangelical and still vote Republican just because of they see the trend going that way, but don't necessarily agree?
Sure. I mean, I hear that a lot, and I think that's important to recognize that exists. I realize for some people who, have this real dislike and fear about Trump, because of some of the actions he's taken, it's hard to hear that, and it's maybe hard to be sympathetic, but I think any accurate portrayal of where people are includes those people who, the reluctant Trump voters. They exist, and, about 20% of evangelicals every election don't vote for Trump. And then, not everyone, many evangelicals will express misgivings about something about him. But it usually comes down to we have a binary choice, essentially. Yes, there are third parties, but because of the way our system works, it's very hard for any of them to get traction, et cetera, et cetera. And so people are sort of going, well, who aligns the most with my values? And if you're someone who is, opposed to abortion and, generally sort of socially and culturally conservative, a lot of people don't feel that the Democratic Party speaks to them. And I think that may be an area where Democrats will try to make some progress. I know they have in the past by employing religious language. But I think there's always, there's a real respect for separation of church and state, and so there's been kind of a discomfort with that. And I think there's a real debate to be had about what's appropriate in the public sphere. And I'm not going to weigh in on that, but it's a tough one because I think, the reality is that many conservative right-wing politicians have been very willing to lean into their religious identity, and that has been an effective tool for mobilizing people and making them feel, people who are religious feel, well, this is the party for me, these are the candidates for me, they're speaking to my concerns.
Thank you.
You mentioned both the nuns and the duns, and I'm wondering if there's research on which denominations those folks came from, if there's more lapsed Catholics, more lapsed Baptists. Do we have any information about that?
There's a little bit. I don't have it all off the top of my head. I know that, I think Catholicism actually is losing more people per capita than evangelicalism. I don't quite know what the split is, but that I do recall that from the data that I've seen. I think the best research on nuns and disaffiliation is being done by the Public Religion Research Institute, which I mentioned. They do deep dive data on religion and politics several times a year, and they're looking at some of this. The Pew Research Center also has some good data. So if you ever want to nerd out and go digging for that, that's where I would look. And I use them heavily in my own work.
Okay, I'll take that tip from you, but I don't think I'll do anything with it, but thank you.
Just if you want to know, if it keeps you up at night.
Yeah. Lastly, you also said they tend to be disconnected politically. So if you were not a journalist and you were a campaign manager, are there some messages that you would create to reach them because their votes?
I am a journalist. Sorry.
I have two questions. I hope that's okay. And the first one isn't directly related to this topic, but I'm wondering, given the intense pressure there is right now on defunding public broadcasting, how is the morale in the newsroom with that?
I mean, I'm pretty focused on my work and my team, and we have people all over the country, and even those of us in Washington try to be out in the world more than in the newsroom. I mean, I would say, and I know this probably sounds like a talking point, but in all honesty, especially my team that's covering politics on the Washington desk, we're so busy all the time and have been forever. I think we're much more focused on the work in front of us. Obviously, we're aware of those concerns and think about them, but that is really not for me to solve. The only thing I can do is do the best work I can and leave that in the hands of our management team. But I will say, I came up through our member station system. I worked at 3 NPR affiliates in the Midwest and South before being recruited by the network, and the role of our members, listeners, is so important and may become even more so in the future. So I just want to thank anyone who is a member of their station. It really makes a difference, and it's a key part of what we do.
Okay. The other question I had is that as you talked about how you visited a number of conservative churches and you've talked with conservative evangelicals who are supportive of Trump. One of the things that I observe in the media is that the more progressive liberal side of Christianity doesn't get the same attention. And I'm wondering, how do we go about doing that? How do we go about letting people know that there are a large percentage of us who see our Christian faith in a very different way and want to offer that in a very clear way to people?
Yeah, I hear this a lot, and thank you for the question. Again, I think some of the groups I mentioned, Sojourners, Vote Common Good, Faith in Public Life, and others are working on this and have been for some time, and especially in the last several years. There's definitely a desire among more progressive Christians to express that message and to be a voice. I think the challenge, and I've covered this, a lot of my colleagues who cover religion and politics have covered it as well. I think one of the challenges for the religious left, aside from the sort of organizational and funding challenges I mentioned earlier, is the fact that evangelicals are one of the largest, even though Christianity is shrinking, evangelicals are still one of the largest and most easily mobilized voting blocks in the country. So depending on whose numbers you believe, evangelicalism is about the same size as Catholicism, and mainline Protestantism is maybe a little smaller, give or take. There are different numbers out there, and they fluctuate, so please don't jump all over me if I've got some of that wrong. But the point is, it's a big group, still is a big group, and the really big thing is that about 80% of white evangelicals vote Republican. For just sort of isolating white Christians, since race maps really importantly over politics, if you look at white Catholics and white mainline Protestants, they vote about 55, 60% Republican. So still majority, but not nearly the overwhelming majority. So if you're a politician or a fundraiser or a political organizer and you want to get Republican votes, going to the evangelical pastors, going to the evangelical organizations, and rallying them, mobilizing them, putting voter guides in their churches, making sure that they know where to vote, how to vote, that is a lot more bang for your buck than anything else. And Democrats can't compete with that, simply because of the nature of the evangelical right. So I think that's also part of why reporters spend a lot of time on evangelicals. They make up something like a third of the Republican base, maybe even more now. And so they're just an influential and unified voting bloc. And one more thing, they vote in higher numbers per capita than most other groups. So,
one of the things you mentioned were demographic changes and how those are impacting evangelicals and the nation. You mentioned disaffiliation. You mentioned the greater appeal that the Republican Party has had with people of color lately. And you didn't talk much about the aging of the evangelical population, but I'd be interested in your predictions for the future of evangelicalism based on all of these things. One of the ministries I work for is supported by all these little old ladies who send money. They're dying off, Yeah. I know that there have been other demographic changes that are also impacting people's views, like the acceptance of same-sex marriage and how that has just become a normal part of society for most people. So I'd be interested to hear your predictions, 10 years, 20 years.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. You're right that evangelicalism is aging a bit faster than the population, I think. The part of that is that, when you're talking about white evangelicalism, obviously you're talking about white Americans, and the white population is aging relative to the non-white population, and a lot of that is driven by immigration trends. And so, from the data that I've seen, the growth, or at least stability in the evangelical movement is not among white Christians. It's mostly among Latinos and to some extent Black Christians, if you can call them evangelical. A lot of the beliefs are very, very similar theologically, but again, pollsters and demographers tend to sort of separate out Black Protestants from white evangelicals for political and cultural reasons. I can't give you a precise prediction for 10 or 20 years out, but I think it's safe to say that evangelicalism is going to shrink or become more diverse, because that's really the nature of the whole country.
So one thing that popped into my head when you were talking is April Ajoy in her book, Star Spangled Jesus. She talks in the book how the election of Donald Trump in 2016 affected her deconstruction. I'm sorry. I wonder how his election affected your own.
Sorry, what was the last? How it affected her deconstruction?
How did Trump's first election affect your own deconstruction? I know you mentioned it a little bit.
Oh yeah. So no, I think a really important point is that I don't think that the exvangelical phenomenon is only because of Trump, but I do think that there was sort of a perfect storm in 2016 of the rise of Trump, the conversations happening around evangelicalism, and the internet was in a place where, again, there was a democratization of social media platforms. People who would maybe not have a voice, especially in more theologically conservative congregations, could easily build a voice and a movement and a following. And so I think it's hard to understate the importance of just that moment in the sort of creation of this identity and this movement, if you want to call it that. For me, though, deconstruction happened long before Trump. I didn't deconstruct because of Donald Trump, but covering Donald Trump occasioned for me reflection on my history and also interactions with other people who had similar backgrounds and experiences.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I have a shelf in my library, which is almost all these millennial memoirists, and your book is in the middle of that. You're all about the same age.
Older every day.
You're old, you're early millennials, and the question is, you grew up in this highly structured environment, and then something when you got to your 20s made that hard to sustain. And I could go through a whole list of people who did that. Maybe it's 9/11, maybe it's a whole bunch of other things. But was there something happening in the broader culture in your 20s that caused that hermetically sealed system to begin to break down?
That's a great question. In some ways, I think Rachel Held Evans who was kind of the first of that cohort. Yeah, and she, was exactly my age within a few months, really. And I think again, it's probably a lot of it is the internet. Well, two things. I think one is that we grew up, those of us who are about my age, grew up at a time when, as I described, the evangelical movement had really kind of gained a critical mass. It was becoming more and more powerful, had this really robust, well-developed subculture, all the parallel institutions we described, which really started in some ways in the 60s, 70s, but had really reached a critical mass by the 80s and 90s. You could be totally ensconced in the evangelical world like I was. So there was that. This deep, deep sheltering that many of us experienced. And then we come of age at a time when, the country's becoming more diverse, more pluralistic, more open to, same-sex marriage, and where the internet is a source of knowledge and connection in a way that, had never existed before. And I think that only has escalated, obviously.
Yeah, that's good.
So you touched on this a little bit earlier, but I wanted to ask just how big a role have external forces like polarization, social media, even the news, played in fracturing the evangelical community or leading to disaffiliation? In your experience, have these outside forces largely bolstered evangelicalism or weakened it?
I think those are all important drivers of disaffiliation and fracturing. And I think if you look more broadly at disaffiliation across the board, again, I think it probably goes back, I'm speculating here. I haven't done a lot of research on the why other than the sort of anecdotal conversations I've had, but I think, again, the information environment that we exist in now, an increasingly diverse country, I think it's just harder and harder for some at least, to hold on to ideas that are really sort of cut off from the larger conversation. But at the same time, I think there are those who find this world overwhelming and find those spaces, retreat into those spaces and find them very safe and comforting. And again, some of the phenomena I was talking about with social isolation and loneliness, I think some of the rhetoric I see from the right really sort of describes a very traditionalist Christian, patriarchal home life as sort of the antidote to all of that, which is interesting.
Thank you.
My experience has shown that, at least for me, what I've seen in society regarding churches is that the evangelicals and the conservative right are fostering this whole idea of we'll provide you the answers. You don't have to know anything. Just believe what I'm telling you and things will be okay. And that has to be very comforting to a lot of people. Would you want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think that kind of speaks to one of the questions earlier about this idea of certainty and believing that we have the truth and we are sort of the chosen people by God to spread that truth to the world. I think it is comforting, and I think in a big, like I said, in a big, scary, dangerous, complicated world, it can be a source of comfort for a lot of people to have a sense of, this is who I am, this is my home, this is what I need to do to live well. And so I think that is explanatory. And I mean, I would just point out that humans have done this forever. It's not like evangelicals are unique in, coming up with a concept of what's going on here, who we are, why are we here, what are we supposed to be doing while we're here. I mean, that's just what religion does. And, I'm not an anthropologist or a sociologist. I think there's some in the room, but, just as an observer of humans, it seems to me that one of the reasons that we do that is because we need to make sense of the world. And, there's a lot of benefit to doing so, but there's also risk.
Thank you so much for your journey. Thank you for your book.
Thank you.
I have a personal question in doing what you do and walking through the journey that you have. How do you fight against anger or hatred or using fear to, make your point? Like, how do we rise above and be an example of humanity whether we believe in the divine or not, that is worthy of following? Or especially doing what you do, like how do you keep that mindset and not let hatred or anger or resentment or shame destroy who you are?
Thank you. Well, I think I'm really glad I didn't write the book until I was about 40, because I'd had some time to process things and mature. And I think, I would have written a very different book in my 20s. I probably would have been angrier. One of the critiques from a couple people in the evangelical or ex-evangelical world of the book were that it wasn't angry enough. And that's fine. I mean, everybody has a right to their own feelings and their own experience. But I didn't want it to be a screed. I wanted, and I also didn't want to, there are reasons, we've kind of been talking around this with the last couple of questions, there are reasons why people are evangelical, there are reasons why people are in religious communities, and some of those are really beautiful and important, and I don't want to discount that, and I wanted to be sure to talk about, some of the things I took from that upbringing and some of the good things about it, because, it wouldn't exist if there weren't reasons for people to stay. And, just for me personally, I was at the Tucson Book Festival a few weeks ago with another memoirist, and someone asked us if it was cathartic to write a memoir, and my counterpart was like, oh gosh, I would never want to write a book for catharsis, that it should only be about the book. And I was like, well, like it or not, it was cathartic to write it, that wasn't why I wrote it, but it was. And so, but I think maybe there's a lesson there for everyone, which is, whether it's talking to a therapist or a friend or journaling, there are just kind of really simple self-care types of things we can all do that, at least in my experience, have been helpful.
Thank you for your talk. Kind of a statistics question. Assuming that most ex-evangelicals abandon core evangelical beliefs like Jesus' divinity, death and resurrection, sort of those sorts of things, are there trends with what beliefs they tend to adopt instead of those?
I wish there were more research on this. I think, I can only really speak to it anecdotally, and, there were some ex-evangelicals I talked to in the book who found themselves in kind of more progressive religious communities, and I don't know their exact theology, but they would still identify with Christianity and I think essential Christian beliefs. There are others that, don't identify as anything at all, or that are just kind of not sure, and I think that's also often a fluid situation. So, there's not a lot of data out there, but I think it's a really interesting question. I also know anecdotally that from doing events like this at a number of mainline churches, and also just from outreach from mainline pastors, I have found that there do seem to be a number of ex-evangelicals in mainline Protestant churches. It does seem to be a place where people go. And of course, within mainline Protestantism, people have a variety of personal beliefs about those things, there's often a lot more room to be uncertain or to not hold to all the doctrines. But I guess that by affiliating with a mainline Protestant church, you're at least sort of part of that tradition in some way.
Well, first of all, thanks for coming out and doing this talk. I think we all appreciate you for doing that. Kind of a two-part question. One, in your process of writing this, what was your favorite aspect of doing this? And then two, how has this process affected your quality of life? Thank you.
Well, thank you. Those are interesting questions. The first one is probably going to be uninteresting to anybody that isn't a NPR reporter. But I really liked, filing stories for NPR. Some of them take weeks and lots of work, but ultimately you get about 4 minutes, maybe 7, maybe for a podcast 30. But I got to spend, in a way, a year, in a way, several years, depending on when you count when I really started this. I got to spend years thinking about a topic I was obviously really interested in and cared about. And so that was really satisfying and it kind of worked a different set of muscles. It was like all the things I love about my day job, interviewing people, doing research, getting to ask questions and follow my curiosity and try to make sense of what's happening in the world, but also just a slower timeline, a more in-depth process. Shoot, I think I forgot the second question. Do you remember what it was?
How has it improved your quality of life?
Quality of life, yes. Well, while I was writing the book, my quality of life was very poor. As anyone who's written a book will tell you, I was working full-time, and I was really in the thick of writing it the year that the Dobbs decision came down, and I was covering abortion at that time. So it was a lot of very late nights and a lot of begging editors for, please let me take this vacation time and not get called in. But it got done. But since then, it's been so meaningful to have conversations like this all over the country with, really wonderful audiences like yourselves with so many thoughtful questions. And I've just heard from so many people who feel like the book spoke to their experience or answered questions that they had about the evangelical movement and the political moment. And that was exactly why I set out to write it. So I would say, at this point in the process, it's been very positive.
Please join me in thanking Sarah McCammon.
Thank you.